Last but not least, our final presentation of the day, Victor C. Okoro, doctoral researcher from the University of Otago. Presentation is on insider threats and intention discernment, a cognitive approach to security. Victor is a PhD researcher at the University of Otago, New Zealand, developing psychological assessments to detect intentions, specifically insider intention to protect or compromise sensitive information and assets of their employer. Welcome to the stage.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. I know it's a bit late, and I'll try to get a move on so we can all go do something else. Thank you so much for that introduction. Before we start, I was hoping we could engage in a sort of imagination exercise, if you will. So imagine you work for a high-tech finance company and you are on the research and development team. You've co-developed a proprietary trading algorithm with immense profit potential. However, in secret, you've been approached by a competitor's organization with an offer for 10 times what you're currently earning with your current employer. However, to take that job, you would need to compromise the sensitive information of your current employer. Would you take that offer? You don't have to answer, just hold that thought and it will become clearer why this scenario was posed. Okay, so that's my topic. I'm a PhD student. Today I'll be talking a bit about a brief introduction to the topic, as well as a brief introduction to myself. I'll talk a bit about the insider threat problem, the theoretical perspectives that I've had to go through in studying it. I'll talk a bit about intention discernment and properly outline my research and end with some conclusions and areas for future research. A bit about myself. I'm originally from Nigeria. My interests span movies, playing basketball, conducting research, playing chess, etc. I firmly believe in the mantra of seize the day, seize the future. It all started with the bachelor's in psychology in Nigeria, where I graduated with first-class honors, moved to the Netherlands, studied psychology as well. And my research was specifically on leadership's influence on product design and company information safety. The information safety aspect was quite intriguing for me, and I knew I definitely wanted to study it a bit more. I did get involved in work as an IT product manager for a couple multinational organizations, as well as co-founded an AI hardware company in the Netherlands. But ultimately, I secured supervision and a scholarship to study the topic I was really fascinated with, which was insider threat detection. And that's when I moved to New Zealand. What's next? That will come. Okay, so when we think of government and private organizations alike, think of your defense, intelligence, tech, finance, etc., companies such as these. They spend a lot in protecting their sensitive information from both internal and external threats. The insider threat problem can be defined as this: security risks to an organization, to their information and assets that are posed by its own employees, costing the organization money, time, and reputation. This chart from the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report of 2022. I like this chart because it shows in gray the amount of breach attempts from internal and external sources, and in yellow it shows the amount of compromised information from those sources. I specifically cited this report because it was a compendium of all previous years, including that year. And every year they publish a report, but it's never a compendium. This was a special edition. We clearly see that although internal actors make up less than 20% of breach attempts, they actually end up compromising over 10 times the amount of information that external actors do. The amount of external breach attempts supports this valuation of the cybersecurity market, which as of 2023 stood at 223 billion. And this compound annual growth rate means that by 2030, it will have more than doubled. However, cybersecurity solutions do not cater to insider threat problem sufficiently. And this results in headlines such as these: the cases of Walter Liu, Anthony Lewandowski of Google and Uber, Paige Thompson of Capital One and AWS, etc. But for every headline that you see about an insider threat incident, there's like 3 more that goes unreported and unpublished, because organizations would largely prefer that the public not know that they were subject to an insider threat incident. And also, this chart from the Ponemons Institute Cost of Insider Threat Global Report shows that the annual cost of a criminal insider, malicious insider, and by that I mean insiders that have formulated an intention to compromise their employer's sensitive information, stood at about 4.1 million US dollars per year per company. Okay, all that said, to explain the insider threat problem, as a researcher, specifically in the Department of Psychology, it is quite normal to view problems from a theoretical lens. For this, I looked at a couple of theoretical perspectives to seek to explain insider threat. The deterrence theory is one that comes up quite a lot. This theory basically is based on the foundation that the right punishment and certainty of punishment will deter people from acting in maladaptive ways. And we see this across society in the way we structure our laws and the information around all of that and so on. However, it's perhaps not the most effective in practice, because when the incentives are high enough, the punishments might be considered a worthwhile risk. The situational crime prevention theory looks at crime as situational and so opportunistic, and this theory, when applied to insider threat, would suggest if you take away the opportunities for employees to engage in malicious behavior, then they won't. So hide your files, don't leave USBs with proprietary information lying around, and so on and so forth. This, of course, ignores the fact that insiders, by virtue of being insiders, will already have access to certain pieces of your proprietary information in order to do their job. The social bond theory: if people are closely knit at work, they're less likely to act in malicious ways to the organization. The social learning theory: the right mix of reinforcements, punishments, and modeling will help people develop only protective behaviors and not malicious ones. There are issues of this, some of which I've already touched upon as I went through them, but a lot of them are quite impractical in real life, as, for instance, the situational crime prevention theory, as I mentioned, supports reducing opportunities, but I've touched a bit on how that's not always possible. There's also no account for intention. So these are systematic approaches to the problem of insider threat, but not so much looking at what guides that eventual behavior, which would be intention in this case, and thus early detection is not really something that's considered. And also in failure, it's simply enough wasn't done. The punishment wasn't severe enough or wasn't certain enough. You didn't get rid of all the opportunities that they could have had. You didn't form a closely knit culture in your organization, and so on and so forth. So it's never the theory's fault, it's your fault. This eventually led me to the theory of reasoned action and its evolution into the theory of planned behavior. Now, basically, this is the theoretical framework for this theory. It basically states that attitudes, subjective norms, and apologies for the acronyms. We learned a bit about that in the previous session, but I'll try to make sure I'm communicating properly. Subjective norms are what I think people I care about would care about and what they would think is good behavior. and perceived and actual behavioral control. So if I want to engage in a certain action, like I want to be fit and jog in the morning, how much of that behavior do I think is up to me, is within my control versus outside of my control? Like, okay, maybe I live in somewhere that's pretty rainy, and so I don't want to go outside when it's raining, and so that's beyond my control. But basically, all of these serve to shape one's intention, and intention eventually shapes one's behavior. This theory proved to, well, in summarizing, the right attitude, subjective norms, and perceived and actual behavioral control will shape an insider's intention to either protect or compromise, and intention begets behavior. This theory did prove to be the most applicable and most comprehensive theory for looking at insider threat, as it not only accounted for intention, it also enveloped variables from other theories such as the deterrence theory, the social learning theory, the social bond and control theory, as well as the situational crime prevention theory. So these are all tenets from those theories, but they can clearly be found within the tenets of this one. This might not matter as much to professionals such as yourself, but trust me, it does from a academic research point of view in terms of laying a solid foundation from which to build your research on. Okay, and now a bit about, intention discernment. Having shown that via the theory of planned behavior, intention is key in predicting one's eventual behavior. Why is it difficult to study intention? And this question is born out of a clear lack of literature and research being done in studying intention. I had to experience this myself when I got into it. But there's two things. The first is because intention can change. It is not static. Now, what you decide to do might not be what you end up doing. However, what you decide to do is a pretty good indicator of what you will end up doing. And there's also subjectivity and social desirability. I'll touch a bit upon that. Right now, we have no way of empirically mind reading someone and knowing what their intention is. So we still, in some way, shape, or form, have to ask them about it and extract it from them. The very fact that it's subjective responses that we're collecting means that social desirability bias can come to play. And that's when people present themselves in a positive light because they do not want to be seen in a negative light. And this is, of course, the case in high impact questions surrounding things like malicious intent and racism and so on and so forth. No one says they're racist. At least most people don't. So some studies have sought to objectively measure intention. Before I proceed, these two issues with studying intention are significant, but they are not a reason not to do it. Intention can change, but what researchers have found is some intentions are more susceptible to change than others. So some intentions, like what I will eat later this evening, can more easily change than will I commit treason to my employer or to my country. And the subjectivity part, I will touch a bit upon how, well, in essence, that is looked to be corrected by not just asking about one's intention, but objectively determining the honesty of their responses about their intention. Some studies that have sought to objectively measure intention include Eichner-Rosenfeld terrorism intention, Augusta et al. Sleep, location, and career intentions, where their participants plan to sleep and what they plan to do in the future. And Suchowski et al. Past stealing behavior and intention to engage in future stealing behavior. However, surprise, surprise, none have been on insider threat intentions. And this is sort of where my research comes in. So my research is focused on combining intention inquisition based on the cognitive load hypothesis. This hypothesis basically states that when people are being deceptive, they tend to devote more cognitive resources to that versus when they're being truthful, because when they're being truthful, they only need to recount one reality versus when they're being deceptive. They have to know what the true reality is, as well as the reality they wish to communicate to you, and processing these multiple realities will demand more cognitive resources. So asking about intentions and combining that with psychophysiological measures of reaction time, eye tracking, and mouse tracking, with the goal of objectively discerning individual intention within high security organizations. Now, the key benefit of this approach, of course, is its proactive nature, thereby allowing for mitigative steps to be taken before an insider threat incident occurs. Okay, thus far in my PhD, which I hope to be graduating from in October this year, I've conducted 4 experiments on this topic. The first one was a 2-door intention scenario. Apologies if this sounds a bit more academical, but it is from the lab that it comes to the physical, I believe. So with this 2-door intention scenario, I had participants come into a room that had 2 doors to exit, and they were to decide on which door they planned to exit the room from at the end of the study. Um, yeah. I can't. Okay, well, and then they would sit the test and then choose a door to exit from. The results from this research supported the cognitive load hypothesis. Reaction time and error rates were significantly increased when participants were being honest about their intention versus when they were being deceptive about their intention. And I wrote an algorithm to predict participants' intention based upon their responses, and it was able to detect 39 out of 40 participants' intention correctly. In my second study, I changed from a 2-door intention scenario to an insider threat intention scenario. So the exact scenario I posed to you at the beginning of this talk, that was exactly what my participants had to go through. Not surprisingly, or maybe a bit surprisingly at the time for me, a lot more people were opting to be protectors than malicious, given the immense rewards. But I guess that's a good sign of society. Here too, the results also supported the cognitive load hypothesis, and 35 out of 40 participants' intentions were able to be correctly discerned. There were 2 false inferences and 3 inconclusives. And in my third study, the insider threat intention scenario stayed the same as in study 2. However, I included the measures of mouse and eye tracking to make the whole test a lot more robust. Here too, there was support for cognitive load hypothesis. Reaction time, error rates, mouse and eye tracking measures were significantly increased when participants were being deceptive versus when they were being truthful about their intention. And 43 out of 43 participants' intentions were correctly discerned. Now, it's important to note that throughout my study 1 to study 3, there was not any incentive for participants to seek to obscure their intention. And so the algorithm that was used in these cases did not include an expectation that some participants would be obscuring their intention. And it's important to note this because in my 4th study, it was the same insider threat intention scenario, but in order to be more empirically and ecologically valid, you would expect that participants that have malicious intention would not want their employers to know that they have malicious intention. So that's exactly what we introduced. We made it such that this test is being conducted by your employer to figure out what your intention is. It's if you have bad intentions, it's probably in your best interest to try to hide it. And so the malicious participants were supposed to do that, obscure their intent over the course of the test. And then the results did support the cognitive load hypothesis. However, the algorithm needed to change to account for this fact that some participants would be obscuring their intention and everyone would say, I'm a protector, I'm not malicious, ultimately. 34 out of 42 participants' intentions were able to be correctly discerned with the current algorithm that was made. That's about 80.9%, but of course, more research and more data collection would hopefully result in higher accuracy. So in conclusion, The theory of planned behavior has shown to be the most holistic and comprehensive framework from which to assess insider threat. The pool of research studies that are aimed at objectively measuring intention is quite limited um, due to the subject matter challenges that I outlined earlier. However, not and even amongst the few, none have been focused on insider threat intention discernment. And finally, using reaction time, mouse tracking, and eye tracking measures, we have been able to show some research support for the cognitive load hypothesis when applied to the insider threat intention discernment topic. My future next steps following my research would be looking to develop a practically applicable intention discernment machine learning algorithm and deploying my research in high security organizations. Thank you so much for your attention. If you have any questions or comments, or you work on insider threat problems within your organization, I'd be happy to have a chat. Yeah, thanks for your attention. Oh,
I just have one question, thanks.
Okay. Yeah,
Michelle,
sorry.
thank you. With regards to putting this in practice, so ultimately your research should be looking at trying to screen out or vet people that may have an intention to behave in a malicious way.
Yes. However, it does come with the disclaimer. It's not necessarily supposed to be a tool to screen out. It's more so a tool to determine what cases might require further attention. But yes.
On the assumption that people, because human nature typically is that typically research would say people behave in a way which is honest. It's not typically dishonest behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So your research design, however, is looking at the people's intention is actually dishonest in most cases.
Well, not necessarily. It doesn't come with an assumption either way that you're going to lean either way. It's more so can intention in its purest form with regards to being an insider threat be discerned, whether you have a protective or a malicious intention coming into it. It will probably be the case that most employees have nothing but protective intentions, but there is always that little amount that ends up compromising over 10 times the amount of information that external attackers are able to compromise. So it's for those people that necessitates tools like this. Brenda? Oh, okay. Sorry.
Sorry, Alex, just a quick question. You said that in your next research, you want to see how this can be used by organizations. Could it be, lots of organizations have code of conduct and they do code of conduct training. So could the answers that staff are asked to acknowledge about the code of conduct in the company be used as precursors to determine their exposure or risk as an insider trader?
Sorry, could you rephrase the question?
So have you looked at code of conduct, which is kind of the rules that employees say that they're going to abide by?
Mm-hmm.
There's always questions after that. So would the algorithm be useful in identifying the way that staff are answering those questions or the time it takes them to answer, whether they are a risk to the organization?
Okay, so the way the test is built, it's a time-locked assessment, independent of an organization's code of conduct or particular documents that they have. It's more so an inquisition as to your intentions coming into the organization. Are they positive or are they negative? Yeah. Does that answer the question? There is a slide that I had to take out in the interest of time that depicts the progression of how such a tool could be practically deployed. And it's basically prospective employees or existing employees that are going for higher security clearances or just as an intermittent test being conducted, like sort of a drug test, they would go to a controlled facility, take this test, and then the test would get analyzed by the algorithm. The results would get provided to personnel with the need to know, like your recruiter, your security clearance provider, etc. And that results would be factored into the decision-making process for granting that person or renewing or extending, or just as a normal check, do we still think this person has the best interests of the organization in mind? And this is a process that is already currently happening in all of these high security organizations. So your governments and organizations with trade secrets and really sensitive and proprietary information. It's not necessarily something that should be used by every organization, just more so those that have informational assets that could have very high impact if compromised.
It's just as answer. Is this be manipulated to provide a false result?
I often get a similar, questions in that vein. There's also often the question of what is the difference between this and a polygraph. Yes, there is no test that is 100% impervious to being manipulated. This is also something that I hope to explore more in future research, is having more and more people try out varying forms of countermeasures to avoid detection. And even in my fourth study, it wasn't 100%, right? There were still some malicious participants that were able to go undetected. So yes, that is a possibility. And if you had the question in your mind, how is this different from a polygraph? A polygraph uses a control question test procedure where they establish a baseline by asking you benign questions like, what is your name? Do you live at this address? Is this your mother's maiden name? And they monitor your levels and then ask you an impactful question like, will you kill this person or did you kill this person? And just the difference in impact of questions in your perception will already elicit a differential response psychophysiologically and even physically to those questions. And that leaves a large room for false positives. However, the testing method that I'm using is a differentiation of deception paradigm. And basically that compares subject matter to subject matter, avoiding that difference in question impact. Cheers. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much, and please have an enjoyable rest of your day.